Good morning. It's time for episode number 10 of our study of the book of Genesis. Today is Genesis chapter 4, verses 16 through 26. This is a study where we are progressively working our way through verse by verse, line by line, word by word, through the book of Genesis. We've come to Genesis chapter 4. Just a recap, the important things that we've been going through in the book of Genesis have been looking at God's creation of the world, God's creation in perfection, Adam and Eve being there, their temptation to be pulled away from God, that is Satan's ultimate goal, is he wants to pull people away from God. They were expelled out of the garden, and in their expulsion from the garden, we are seeing sin take hold in the world. The world begins to operate in a sin state. And so we're going to see that really played out today in the rest of chapter 4, verses 16 through 26. So last time we looked at the story of Cain and Abel. That Abel was a shepherd. He tended the flocks. Cain was a farmer. He tilled the ground. They both brought an offering to God. Abel's was of the first fruits, but Cain's was just some of the produce that he had produced in the ground. Now we don't know how they brought that to God. We don't know how God was interacting with them at the time, but we just know that they brought it to God. God looked at Cain's offering and rejected it. It was not okay because it was just an afterthought. It was not the first fruits. It was just whatever we had left over. Abel's offering, though, was something completely different. That was the first fruits. It was the first part of the flock. It was the first ones that were born. There was no guarantee that more were going to come. It was just a trusting in God. It was a faith-filled exercise, and God had high regard for that. And I think that the lesson in that is that God has regard for those things that we offer to Him, trusting that He will provide the rest. He wants our first fruits. We offer to Him, we bring to Him, we sacrifice to Him, we give to Him, and we trust Him for the rest, that He is going to come through and provide. And God always does, because God is faithful. He tells us to test us in those things, and He will show to us how faithful He is. And so it was a step of faith. It was an act of faith. Well, Cain was very bothered by this, to the point that he began to hate Abel in his heart. He premeditated murdered him, and the result was that he was going to be driven from God's presence, whatever presence they still had at the time. Now he was going to be driven even further away. He was going to undergo the judgment of God. He would complain about the harshness of the punishment that he was going to face, yet he still had to face the punishment of God. Now we're going to see in the rest of chapter 4 that as Cain moves away with his family or his wife, possibly children. It doesn't indicate that, but most likely he had children who he took with him. He's going to have another child, and more children. But in the driving him out, sin is just taking hold, and society really begins to decay, with Cain leading that society astray. So let's look at this together. And we're going to look at just a really messed up group of people in Genesis chapter 4, verses 16 through 26. So let's jump into this. Then Cain went out from the presence of the Lord and dwelt in the land of Nod, on the east of Eden. So we know that he was kicked out. He went out and he was a vagabond. He was wandering around. He came to this location east of Eden, where he was going to settle down. Now we know that he must have already had a wife and a family at that time when he was there with Abel, his brother. They went out with him when he was kicked out of whatever area that they were still living in. It says Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch. Now we know that that phrase is had sexual relations with. Cain knew his wife. He had sexual relations with his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch. Now, this doesn't mean that this was his only child. It doesn't mean that this was his first child. This is a child that he had, Cain, and it would have been the child maybe that was born after he had been expelled from whatever area that they were in at the time, where he was living in close proximity to his brother Abel and to his mother and father, Adam and Eve. So he went out, he bore a child. Enoch was his name, and there was a city that they would build How do you inhabit the city? Well, probably through a large, massive population that would be born out of all of the children of Cain, of his wife, of his wives. They would have a massive amount of children, and then all of the children's children would be having children. And so out of that came a city, and they named the city after his son, and the city was called Enoch. So we know that he would have had that she would that his wife would have been most likely his sister. We know that Genesis chapter 5 verse 4, it says that Adam and Eve had other sons and daughters. So we know that it was most likely his sister that he was marrying. It would have to probably be his sister, though marrying his sister would be against God's law according to Leviticus. There are 3 different references in Leviticus, one in the book of Deuteronomy, and it prohibits marrying a sister, even up to a half sister. But this was spoken well after God spoke the law to Moses. So this was well before any of that, probably 1500, well, probably 2500 years before God gave that command. So he would have had this relationship with a sister. Now, the reason we can know this is that the gene pool of humanity was still pure enough and close enough to the actual creation of Adam and Eve that there was not the harm of inbreeding. And that will happen later. The stream will be polluted later, so there's a prohibit against inbreeding later, but at this time that most likely is not going to be an issue whatsoever. Even Abraham married his half-sister Sarah in Genesis chapter 20 when we get to that point. So he built, he had a child, he had children, he probably had multiple wives, and he had multiple children, so much so that they were able to build a city. Now, the purpose of this city was to be a place where they could live, but what we're going to see in this city is that the city is not God-centered, it is man-centered. This city is going to be corrupt, it's going to be chaotic, and the fall of the human race is going to be amplified in the picture of this city. The fall of the human race would continue, and it would even escalate and increase as we keep going through the generations that followed Cain. Now again, they lived prior to those days for, probably close to 1,000 years, and so think about the numbers of people that would be born through the advanced ages that they were living to. So you could easily have 1 million people or up to 1 billion people before the time of the flood that will happen really in the next chapter. And so let's keep going and keep looking at this. So here we have the generations that followed Cain. Now Cain would have still been alive because they were living for hundreds and hundreds of years. But what I want you to note here is not just all of the names, and by the way, I'm going to read these names phonetically. We don't really have a good idea of how they would be pronounced, so I'm just going to pronounce them phonetically. I know I'm going to butcher these names, so please forgive me for that. But there's something about this list and what's going to happen, and I want to show you what this means and why these are important. So it says this: to Enoch was born Irad, and to Irad was born Mehujalah, and Mehujalah begot Methuselah, and Methuselah begot Lamech. Then Lamech took for himself 2 wives. The name of one was Ada. The name of the second wife was Zillah, and Ada bore Jabal. He was the father of those who dwell in tents and have livestock. His brother's name was Jubal. He was the father of all those who play the harp and flute. And as for Zillah, she also bore Tubal-Cain, an instructor of every craftsman in bronze and iron. And the sister of Tubal-Cain was Naamah. Now, the names are not necessarily important. Just remember and keep in mind that Cain would have had hundreds and hundreds of children, most likely with multiple wives, and all of the names could not possibly be listed. There would have been a population growth between Adam and Eve, their children, their children's children, between all of their children, going on for several generations, for several lines that would happen. So it's not important all the names that are listed. However, there is an importance here, and I want just to write this word. There was what I would call an advancement. And the advancement is going to be twofold. You're going to see an advancement that's going to happen in civilization, That's going to be one kind of advancement, and then you're going to see an advancement in sin. Those are the two advancements that you're really going to see as the population is growing and increasing rapidly. This picture that we're given in this part of chapter 4 is the picture of just rapid advancement. Succeeding generations quickly made progress. What did they make progress in? Well, we have an example in the previous slide that I showed you. We have an example of progress in city building. So they were able to come together and found a city. We also have the example of they made progress in the way that they would dwell in tents. Now that's a picture of home building. Really the word dwelling in tents was a phrase talking about creating a dwelling place. We also have an advancement in music. We have this person who is the father of those who play the harp and the flute. So they are starting to compose music, to create music. That's one of the things that we're seeing an advancement in. Then there's somebody who is an instructor of every craftsman dealing with bronze and iron. And so think of the culture that is growing out of this. Now this goes against what archaeologists and anthropologists say happened at the very beginning. They believe that there were just these Neanderthals who would dwell in caves who had no discernible skills or abilities whatsoever. Well, the Bible really contradicts that, because the Bible shows us that when they came together, these first generations, these first groupings of people, that what did they do? They built homes, they built cities, they learned music, they learned culture, they composed music, they learned how to deal with iron, they learned how to deal with bronze, and so there was a rapid advancement of what happened in those first generations according to what the Bible says. Now, again, archaeology says that it was very different than this. Modern theories say this could not have happened because this is not the evidence we're seeing. By the way, the evidence that we see is post-flood evidence. We don't see pre-flood evidence because, except for fossils or dinosaur bones that we find, we are not finding the other things, because think of the effects of the flood having on that civilization. But we know that civilization would have advanced rapidly. We can't even fathom in our minds what that civilization would have been like as they came together, and in millions of people, even to 1 billion or more people, they would advance in varieties of way. Now, I want to just point out one name to you, because this is going to be a name when it comes not just to the advancement of civilization, but the advancement of sin, and that is going to be the name Lamech. Lamech had 2 wives. Now, one of the wives, his name was Ada. Ada's name means pleasure, ornament, or beauty. The other's wife's name was named Zillah, which means shade, which probably referred to a luxurious covering of hair. His daughter's name was named Naamah, which means loveliness. So Lamech's culture was committed to physical and outward beauty, because that's the names that were chosen that described physical and outward beauty. Now, the name Lamech means conqueror, and he was going to have an arrogance about him that was in contrast to other people in other parts of the lineage that was born. But Lamech was full of arrogance. He was a conqueror, and he is going to be the example for the advancement of sin. Lamech was, by the way, he was going to show us the continuation of Cain and the sin that was in Cain's heart. So let's look at this in verse 23 and 24. Then Lamech said to his wives, Ada and Zillah, in arrogance, he said this, just an arrogance, boastful, prideful attitude, which shows us the advancement of sin in that culture. He said, hear my voice, wives of Lamech, listen to my speech, for I have killed a man for wounding me, even a young man for hurting me. If Cain shall be avenged 7-fold, then Lamech 77-fold. So what is Lamech doing? He is boasting about the murder of somebody else. It is a man-centered perspective that he had. And he believed that he could promise a greater retribution than God. It was just this denigration among humanity. Things quickly became worse with the human race. It was a de-evolution of the human race, not an evolution of the human race. Current scientists believe in evolution. They believe in a continual progressive getting better in evolution. But that's not what the Bible indicates. The Bible indicates a de-evolution where things quickly become worse and worse and worse to the point that God is going to step in, intervene, and destroy them all. This is man's perspective. This is the picture of humanism. This city was focused on murder. It was focused on beautiful wives. It was focused on the outward appearance. It was full of perceived strength. It was full of boasting and prideful. All of these things, by the way, would amount to their destruction. They are never again heard from in the Bible. Lamech, in all of his boasting, came to nothing. But all of this shows you is the rapid decline of civilization because of sin being in the picture. Sin creates decline in society. Sin creates de-evolution of society. We get worse. We don't get better. Mankind, left to their own devices, does not get better. They only get worse. When God is not a part of the picture, the society will decline and go into utter chaos and decay. We're seeing that in our society as well. When you remove God from the picture, when you take him out of the equation, society quickly crumbles and it de-evolves into something that is an abomination in God's eyes. We need God to be at the center of life. We need him to be at the center of families. We need him to be at the center of marriages. And if he is not, everything basically disintegrates into something that God absolutely hates. And what will happen as a result of this? God will bring his wrath upon the world because of the way society has become. Now, this again is the picture of what's going on in our world. Our world has not gotten better. Our world has only gotten worse because we have removed God further and further to not only just to the fringes, but we have removed him from every aspect of society. The world gets worse until God finally unleashes his wrath and brings the world back into order, until he brings his creation back to where he wants it to be. Well, we're going to close chapter 4 with two final verses. Here's what it says. And Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son and named him Seth. For God has appointed another seed for me instead of Abel, whom Cain killed. And as for Seth, to him also a son was born, and he named him Enoch. The men began to call on the name of the Lord. And so you see two contrasting points that are happening here. We see one, in the city of Cain, we see decline, and we see sin, and we see pride, and we see utter chaos. We have arrogance and boasting and a focus on beauty, and we have these sinful activities that are happening. That is in the city of Cain. But in the city or in the place of Adam and Eve, now you have Seth being born, and now you have born to him Enosh, and in this place you have a group of people who are doing what? They are calling on the name of the Lord. Calling on the name of the Lord. Even in those wicked days, the worship of God was not unknown to them. It was very much known. Some have called Genesis chapter 4, verse 26, that final phrase, the first revival, because it was the first indication of a spiritual resurgence after a decline that had been happening. So we have the mention of the advancement of society, the advancement of sin in that society, but a handful of people, a group of people who experienced what we could call a great revival, because in this great revival, they began to worship, they began to call on the name of the Lord, a small remnant who actually knew him and decided that they were going to follow him as God. That's the picture of our society today. In our society today, there is great decline. Though there is rapid advancement, technology advancement, city advancement, around the world there is advancement, but at the same time there is a spiritual decline, a pride, a sin, chaos in the world. But in the world you have a remnant of people who believe in revival, who call upon the name of the Lord and worship him despite the things that are happening around us. A spiritual resurgence in the midst of rapid chaos and decline. And that's what we have today. And I am blessed to count you among those who say, we will, in the midst of all of the chaos, we will worship him and we will call on the name of the Lord. Well, next time we'll get into chapter 5. Thank you for spending some time with me this morning, and I look forward